I wanted to get my ex-husband back, so when he came to see our daughter I tried to seduce him, but he told me to cover up, that it was cold. After that, he left with the girl. Leonardo looked me up and down in the parish hallway with Emilia holding his hand, and without even frowning he uttered that phrase that still burns me, that I should cover up, that it was cold, that he was there for his daughter. That's why I felt all eyes on my cleavage, on my heels, on my frozen smile, while he turned around with the girl, as if I were just an extra in the scene. And the worst part is that in the same church where they had applauded me for being the exemplary mother, no one came up to ask me what was behind that moment. So if you want to understand why we got to that point, I have to tell you how it all came together. I never stopped going to the same parish, not even on the ugliest days of the divorce. While other women disappear out of shame, I decided I wasn't going to give my place to Leonardo too. The parish was my stage, my refuge, and my proof that despite what had happened, I was still a good mother who took her daughter to mass, to catechism, to everything. I got involved in the choir, the raffles, the snacks, the catechism classes, everything there was. Everyone knew more or less that he had left the house and that I had stayed with Emilia. I didn't need to invent anything, just drop a few loose phrases about the crosses of marriage that some can't bear and about how God knows who really gets to keep the children. People put the pieces together on their own and looked at me with that mix of pity and admiration that is so comforting when one feels that life has not been fair. Over time, that role of a dignified martyr became comfortable for me. The ladies from the Rosary group asked me for help because they said I was always available. The priest would mention mothers who, despite everything, remained firm with their children in the faith, and although he didn't say my name, I felt he was talking about me. Emilia grew up surrounded by pews, songs, and candles, and I was clear that, at least there, no one could say I was irresponsible. Leonardo, on the other hand, was a distant shadow, a name that came up when it was time to talk about child support or visits, but not someone who was present in the daily life of the parish. That's why, when he started coming more often, I felt like someone was invading a territory I already considered mine. At first, he would just quickly pass by the door to pick up Emilia, almost without entering, as if the church were a ticket window. But then he started staying for the children's mass, sitting in the back pew, silent, not drawing attention. I would see him from the front while we rehearsed songs with the little ones, and something would boil inside me. It wasn't just anger, nor was it just sadness. It was a strange mix of annoyance, because he seemed so calm, and a pang in my chest, because he looked better than before, thinner, better dressed, with clothes that fit him well, as if the divorce had done him wonders. Emilia would come back from her visits talking about him with a joy that made me uncomfortable. She'd tell me that her dad had taken her to the park, that he had treated her to ice cream after Mass, that he had bought her new socks because he said the ones she had were old. I listened to all of this with a stiff smile, saying that I thought it was good that he was finally taking on his role, but inside I felt the ground moving under me. Suddenly, he was no longer the absent father I could vaguely accuse. He was becoming the fun and loving dad everyone wanted to see. And in that tension, I began to think that maybe something could be put back together, that if he saw me dressed up and confident again, he would remember what we had, the family, how good everything looked from the outside. I'm not going to pretend that what I did was innocent. The day I decided to do something was a communion Sunday, one of those when the parish is full, the children are in white suits, and the mothers discreetly compete to see who looks best. I knew Leonardo would come by early for Emilia to take her to breakfast after Mass. I knew there would be movement, people, eyes, and I told myself it was the perfect moment for him to realize what he was missing. I looked in my closet for a fitted dress I had barely worn since before getting married, one that highlighted everything the gym and stress had toned. I put on high heels, did my eye makeup more than usual, used a strong perfume that left a trail. My mother looked me up and down before I left and muttered that it was a lot of production to go to church. I replied that God sees the heart, not the clothes, that the important thing was to be there. I wasn't going to explain to her that every detail was planned so that Leonardo would see me first as a woman and then as a mother. I arrived early, moved around the entrance hall, helping to place chairs, laughing loudly with some ladies from the choir, bending over a little more than necessary when I picked things up from the floor, making sure the dress did its job. I felt the looks and, far from bothering me, they confirmed that I had done the right thing in dressing that way. When Leonardo entered, I saw him from afar. He was wearing a well-ironed shirt, pants that fit him better than in the last years of our marriage, his hair neat. He had that face of a man who has things under control. He greeted with a quick good morning. He bent down to hug Amelia with a smile he didn't give me. I approached with the full intention that the situation wouldn't remain a cold exchange between father and daughter. I positioned myself close, brushing his arm with mine as I passed, and made a comment about how handsome he looked, about how anyone would think he was the one being celebrated. I said it with that tone between a joke and a compliment that he used to love. I expected something, a look up and down, a half smile, a minimal comment about how I looked. Some sign that I had at least thrown him off balance. Instead, I saw his eyes go down for a second to my cleavage and then straight to Amelia's jacket. With a calm that I found offensive, he adjusted it on the girl's shoulders and said, referring to me, that I should cover up, that it was cold, and that he was there for his daughter. Not for that, without raising his voice, without dramatizing. Just that dry phrase, like a slammed door disguised as a warning. I felt the blood rush to my face. There was a weird silence around. A lady from the prayer group looked down. Another pretended not to have heard, but the tension was noticeable. I stood there in the hallway, not knowing whether to cover my cleavage with my hands, to laugh, to respond with some hurtful phrase. Leonardo took Amelia by the hand, told her to hurry up because it was getting late for breakfast, and walked down the hall as if nothing had happened. Not a look back, not a separate explanation, nothing. He left me standing at the church door with the dress, the heels, the perfume, and the feeling of having been made to look ridiculous in front of half the world. I went through the rest of the Mass on autopilot. I sang the songs, made the responses, smiled politely, but inside I just heard that phrase repeating. I wasn't thinking about whether I had crossed the line or not. The only thing that burned was that he had had the audacity to talk to me like that in the house of God, in front of Amelia and in front of people who knew me, who knew everything I did for the parish. I kept telling myself that he could have just said hello, that it wasn't necessary to humiliate me like that if he didn't want anything to do with me, it was enough to keep his distance, not to give me moral lessons. When the Mass ended, I stayed for the snack afterwards, as always. I wasn't going to give others the spectacle of seeing me hide in my house over a comment. I approached the coffee table where some friends from the prayer and catechism group were. They asked me, as always, if everything was okay, if Leonardo had come on time for Amelia. And there I had my chance to frame the story in the way that made the most sense to me. I told them that he had judged me for how I was dressed in front of our daughter, that he had told me to cover up as if I were some floozy, that I just wanted us to get along for Amelia's sake, and that he had responded with contempt. I didn't see the need to detail the fitted dress, the heels, the strategic laughs, or the arm brush. Those things would only distract from the important point that he had been cruel and cold. Laura, one of the most fervent in the group, was immediately indignant, saying it was disrespectful for a man to humiliate his daughter's mother, especially in church. Another commented on how sad it was that after everything I did in the parish, he treated me like that. As I listened to them take my side without asking for more information, I felt that some of the lost balance was being restored. Maybe he had disarmed me with a phrase in the hallway, but at least in my immediate circle, I was still the misunderstood woman whom an insensitive man didn't know how to value. Comments. Anonymous user 1 says, "You yourself admit that you dressed up as if for a nightclub, that you moved, laughed, and touched him on purpose, and yet you pretend the serious thing was that he asked you to cover up. It wasn't a gratuitous humiliation, it was a pretty gentle way of telling you he wasn't going to play your game. You used your daughter and the parish as a stage to see if you still had him wrapped around your finger, and when it didn't work, you ran to tell it as if you were the victim." OP's response. "The easy thing is to reduce it all to me being dressed up, as if that were a crime. Yes, I made myself look nice. Yes, I wanted to remember that I'm not just the mom in sweatpants. That doesn't give anyone the right to talk to me that way, especially in a place where we're supposed to treat each other with respect. If he didn't want anything, it was enough to remain cordial and focus on the child, not to make comments about my clothes in front of others to look like the proper one. Anonymous user I says, you say the parish was your refuge, but in reality you turned it into your stage. You fed on the looks, on the pity of being the long-suffering mother everyone praises. As soon as he showed up and stopped fitting into that role you had created, you started seeing him as an invader. Seducing him right there was the logical step for someone who wants to win back not so much the man, but the attention she had when they were together. OP's response. If the parish was my stage, at least it was one where I worked my butt off helping, not like him, who just came, picked up the girl, and left. I don't see anything wrong with wanting to get the family back together and using the moments we coincide to try to smooth things over. I don't know at what point that became a reason for judgment. Everyone talks about fighting for the marriage, but when one tries it in her own way, then that's also wrong. Anonymous user 3 says, the most revealing thing is that when you tell the scene to your friends, you omit precisely the parts that change the tone of the story. You don't say how you were dressed, or the little laughs, or the suggestive comment you made to him. You only present yourself as the poor woman who is told to cover up. That's not venting. It's manipulating the narrative to keep fitting into the role of the misunderstood saint that you like so much. OP's response. When one is hurt, one doesn't make detailed inventories of every gesture for the rest to decide if the pain is valid or not. I told what hurt me, the way he spoke to me in front of our daughter and people who see me work every day. I'm not going to make a list of every step I took or every laugh I let out, because that only serves to make others feel entitled to judge whether I deserve the comment or not. And honestly, I had enough just swallowing the embarrassment without also having to justify every inch of fabric. Update 1. That same Sunday after Mass, when we went down to the hall for snacks, I still felt Leonardo's phrase echoing in my head. I moved between the tables with the tray of juices and pastries as usual, but inside I was boiling. I didn't know if I was more upset about what he said or the cold way he just turned around with Amelia, as if I were invisible. That's when I saw Laura sitting with a group of ladies from the Rosary group and decided I wasn't going to swallow all that alone. I needed someone to understand that what had happened wasn't just anything. I approached with a nothing's wrong face. I waited for the table to clear a bit, and when it was almost just her and me, I let out an exaggerated sigh and said that Leonardo had disrespected me again. Laura, who always shows concern for sisters in difficulty, immediately leaned towards me and asked what had happened. I didn't go into details about heels, a tight dress, or strategic laughs. I told her that my ex, in front of our daughter, had told me to cover up as if I were some floozy, that he had judged me for how I was dressed in the middle of church, that he had treated me as if I were provoking something indecent. I focused on his tone, his harshness, that he used those words just when I was trying to keep the relationship cordial. Laura was instantly indignant. She said it was disrespectful for a man to speak that way to his daughter's mother, especially in a sacred place. I nodded, lowering my eyes as if it were hard for me to even repeat it. I added that I just wanted things to be civilized for Amelia's sake, that I didn't understand why he had to humiliate me instead of just saying hello. And that was it. I commented with a pained air that it seemed Leonardo was bothered by seeing me well, that he would almost prefer me to be a mess, so he could continue to see himself as the only adult in the story. Laura, of course, said those phrases I needed to hear. That God sees my heart, that he knows who truly suffers, that men often aren't up to par. It didn't take long for the conversation to grow. At the same snack time, another lady came up to hug me, saying she had heard something and was encouraging me. I just said that I didn't want to speak ill of my daughter's father, but that some things hurt. I let them fill in the blanks, let them imagine the scene however they wanted. One commented on how sad it was that a man would humiliate his daughter's mother over clothes. Another said it was typical of some men who forget everything one did while they were very busy. I barely had to push the story. It was enough to nod and drop a phrase here and there for everyone to side with me. In the following days, I began to notice small gestures that confirmed the story was already spreading. A lady from the choir stopped me in the hallway to tell me not to pay attention, that God takes care of putting everyone in their place. Another sent me a message saying to count on her prayers because she knew it wasn't easy dealing with such a harsh ex. No one asked me exactly how I was dressed, or what I said, or what I was looking for. The focus was on him telling me to cover up, on him speaking to me that way in the house of God, on me remaining faithful to the parish while he came and went only when it was convenient for him. At some point, I don't know by whose hand, the story reached the priest. Obviously not the full version, but that polished version that remains when it passes from mouth to mouth, that my ex, every time he came to see the girl, told me to cover up, that he treated me with contempt in front of Amelia, that I remained firm in the parish. Despite everything, I didn't go to the priest directly, but I didn't do anything to stop what was being said either. I thought that for once it wouldn't hurt for someone in authority to know what I had to put up with. In my head, it was a way of balancing out a bit how unfair that moment in the hallway had been. And so, without me fully planning it, but without opposing it either, what had been a sharp phrase from Leonardo became a shared story in the parish. The man who judges his daughter's mother for how she dresses. The woman who just wants peace for the sake of the child. I still felt hurt, but at least I had something important. Witnesses who confirmed, even if partially, how cruel he could be. Comments on the update. 1. Anonymous user 1 says, "It's not that the story grew unintentionally. You yourself chose what to tell and what to keep quiet. You went to Laura with the script already prepared. He humiliated you. You just wanted peace. You removed everything that showed you were trying to provoke him and left only what made you look like a victim. That's not venting, it's conscious manipulation of how others will see you." OP's response. When one is hurt, one tells what hurt. One doesn't do a forensic reconstruction of every movement of the day. I didn't sit down to design a script. I simply spoke from the feeling of shame and contempt I felt. He could have ignored my clothes and focused on his daughter, but he chose to make a comment he knew would hurt. If people later see that as a lack of respect, it's not my fault for telling it, but his for having said it. Anonymous user I says, "What you did was make sure you had an audience on your side. Instead of admitting you tried to seduce him in an inappropriate place, you ran to seek emotional and moral support, but only with the convenient part of the story. The ladies didn't fill in the blanks just because. You left them there on purpose so they would imagine a cruel man and a good woman. It wasn't enough for you to stage the scene. You also needed applause." OP's response. Applause is not exactly what I felt when he spoke to me like that in front of everyone. I needed support. Someone to remind me that I wasn't crazy for feeling hurt. If I hadn't said anything, I would have had to swallow the scene alone as if it were normal. And it wasn't. I'm not going to add details that would only serve for everyone to now start measuring how many inches of fabric justify a comment. So, I stuck with the essential. The way he addressed me in front of our daughter. Anonymous user 3 says, "You talk as if the priest and the ladies invented the whole part about him despising you, but you're the one who sets the tone. If you had said, 'It hurt, but I recognize I was out of line,' the story would have been different. You didn't want context, you wanted confirmation. And now it bothers you that they point out that this chain started with you, not with him." OP's response. I don't know anyone who, at the moment their dignity is touched, starts to qualify so much. At that moment, I wasn't doing analysis. I was trying to hold myself together. That others now want to read every word as a calculated strategy is easy when they're not the ones who were left standing in the middle of the hallway. I shared what I felt was unfair. If the rest then decide to make theories, that's out of my hands. Update 2. The following Sunday, I arrived at Mass with the same punctuality as always, although with a knot in my stomach that I couldn't quite understand. I had already heard enough indirect comments to know that the topic of Leonardo and my clothes had spread more than I thought. Still, I sat in my usual place, near the catechism children, ready to do what I always did, be present, sing, show that nothing could take me away from my spot. When the priest began the homily, I thought it would be just another one about the day's gospel. Until I heard the first words. He spoke of scandal and example for the little ones. He said that children learn more from what they see than from what they hear. That sometimes adults use their children as an excuse for their personal dramas with their ex-partners to provoke, to get attention, to measure who wins. I felt my back stiffen in the pew, but I wanted to believe it was a general topic. Then he added that it's not enough to say, I go to Mass, I'm in the choir, I help with catechism, if at the same time one plays with sensuality in sacred places. And it was impossible not to feel that the words were falling directly on me. The priest spoke, without naming anyone, of a mother who comes dressed as if for another environment, who uses every encounter with her daughter's father as a stage to test again if she is still desired, putting the child and the church in the middle. He even mentioned the way the parish hallways are turned into a catwalk for matters that should be resolved in private. I felt the blood drain from my face. Suddenly, all the pews seemed to turn towards me, although I knew not all of them were doing it openly. Some looked at the floor, others pretended to look in the songbook. While he continued speaking, part of me wanted to sink into the seat and disappear, and another part became defensive. I told myself I was exaggerating, that he was surely referring to general cases, that I wasn't the only divorced woman who dressed up for Mass. I tried to convince myself that the coincidence of details was just that, a coincidence. But every time he said that we can't pretend to have a saintly face while using our children as pawns in games of seduction and pride, I felt he was describing me with uncomfortable precision. When the homily ended, the atmosphere was strange. No one said my name, no one pointed at me, but there was a density in the air. Some people didn't dare to look at me, others did it too quickly, as if to check my reaction. I adopted that neutral expression used when one refuses to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them break down. I sang the Sanctus. I went to communion as always. I kept my head high, but inside I carried a new weight. It was no longer just what had happened with Leonardo in the hallway. Now it was the feeling that the priest, who had so often praised me for being involved in everything, was using the pulpit to single me out without naming me. I left Mass with a divided heart. One part felt exposed, as if a mask had been ripped off me in front of everyone. Another part seethed with the idea that it wasn't fair to use such a public space to talk about such delicate matters that could have been handled perfectly well in private. I wondered why no one had come to talk to me before, why the priest hadn't called me aside if he was so concerned about the scandal. Instead, he chose to drop that homily that half the town could interpret as a direct message to me. In the following days, in my head, the homily began to take another form. I started repeating that the priest had generalized too much, that it wasn't fair for him to use such a specific example when he only had secondhand versions. I told myself that he didn't know what I was going through, that it was very easy to speak from the altar without having endured a divorce, a custody battle, a daughter asking questions you don't know how to answer. Gradually, in my internal narrative, I went from feeling alluded to feeling unjustly exhibited. It was easier to live with the idea that the sermon had been exaggerated than to admit that the description fit me too well. Comments on Update 2. Anonymous user 1 says, "The priest didn't single you out without knowing. The problem is that you yourself spread the story to half the parish. First, you sought validation by telling an incomplete version, and when that snowball reached the altar, you were outraged that they described you. It wasn't an unprovoked attack, it was the consequence of turning your personal dramas into a church hallway topic." OP's response. I didn't tell the priest what to preach or how to do it. If he wanted to take a specific case and turn it into an example, that was his decision. It's one thing to vent to trusted friends and another to have the microphone used to give lessons that fit me, yes, but that didn't take into account everything that was behind it. He could have talked to me directly if he was so concerned. He chose to do it publicly, and that says more about his way of handling things than mine. Anonymous user I says, "You say he didn't name you, but everyone understood who he was talking about. If it hurt you so much, it's because you know that what he described is exactly what you did. Using the encounter with your ex and the presence of your daughter as a stage for seduction. Instead of acknowledging that they saw you, you prefer to take refuge in the idea that it was general or exaggerated, as if changing the words changes the facts." OP's response. And what do you expect me to do? Stand up in the middle of Mass and say, "Yes, Father, I am that example"? No, I have the right to process things at my own pace. Just because a sermon strikes a chord doesn't automatically mean that everything said is fair or balanced. It seems to me that a complicated situation was greatly simplified, and that people wanted to see only one side of that coin doesn't oblige me to applaud the homily as if it were perfect. Anonymous User 3 says, the most striking thing is that you're more bothered by how they told you than what they told you. There's not a single line where you ask yourself if they were right about the example you were setting for your daughter. Everything revolves around whether it was the place, the tone, the form. You keep avoiding looking at the substance, because if you did, you would have to admit that the homily hurt you precisely because it described you. OP's response. I'm not going to deny that it hurt, but I'm also not going to accept that a homily, just because it comes from a priest, is automatically the exact portrait of what's happening. There are many things that only those of us inside the story know. If I focus on the form, it's because that's what turns something already difficult into a spectacle against me. I work on the substance in my own way. I don't have to display every reflection just so others believe I'm doing enough soul-searching. Update 3. After that Mass, I began to notice that something had shifted in my place within the parish. It wasn't immediate, nor was it an open scandal, but it was there, floating. The ladies from the Rosary group still greeted me, but with a new certain reserve. The parents of other children smiled at me, although they no longer sought me out as much to organize things. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was sensitive because of the homily, that it would pass with time. Until one Sunday, at the end of the 10 o'clock Mass, Anna, the catechism coordinator, approached me with that tense smile used to deliver uncomfortable news. She took my arm gently and asked if we could talk for a moment in the sacristy. I followed her, feeling a tingling in my stomach. She closed the door, took a deep breath, and told me that she really liked me in the group, that she valued everything I had done for the children and for the activities, but that for the time being they preferred not to count on me for things directly related to the little ones. Catechism, children's choir, get-togethers. She called it a prudential decision, nothing more. I just stared at her, not fully understanding what that meant in practice until I realized they were pushing me out of the spaces where I shone the most. I tried to defend myself. I told her that everything being said were exaggerations, that I had only wanted to look nice one day, that the problem was that my ex had overreacted. I reminded her that I had always been punctual, committed, that the children loved me, that I prepared materials, that it wasn't fair for one misinterpreted scene to erase all of that. Anna listened to me in silence, with a soft but firm gaze. When I finished, she sighed and said that the problem wasn't my clothes, but what I was doing with the situation, that they couldn't mix my personal conflicts with the children's formation spaces, that there were things that, even if not said out loud, the little ones perceived. That phrase hurt me more than the homily. I saw myself as the exemplary mother who was always on the front lines, and suddenly they were telling me that my presence was no longer so desirable near the children. Not because I was a bad mother according to them, but because I was bringing my adult messes into an environment that should be free of them. I felt like a title I had built with years of being available for everything was being ripped away from me. I was forced to nod my head because I knew that if I started arguing at that moment, I would end up crying or saying things I would regret. I left the sacristy with a mix of shame and anger. To my closest friends, I summarized the situation by saying that because of gossip, they had decided to remove me from some groups. I told it as if it were an unjust punishment for a misunderstanding fueled by nosy people. I didn't repeat Anna's full sentence to them because acknowledging that the problem was what I was doing with this situation would have meant admitting that there was more to it than just clothes. I stuck with the version where I was the victim of others' exaggerated prudence. From then on, my presence in the parish changed. I still went to Mass. Yes, but I no longer directed the children's choir, I no longer organized activities at get-togethers, they no longer asked me for special readings. I became someone who sits, participates, and leaves. The looks that once sought my approval now surrounded me with a certain distance. I told myself it was a matter of time, that they would eventually understand they had been unfair, that they couldn't do without someone so dedicated forever. But deep down, I began to notice that the place where I most liked to shine was slowly closing off to me. Comments on Update 3. Anonymous User 1 says, they didn't push you out because of gossip, they pushed you out because you brought your games with your ex into the same space where you worked with children. Anna told you clearly. The problem wasn't the dress. It was that you used every encounter to see if you could still provoke, with your daughter and other minors around. The parish had the right to protect that environment, even if it hurts you to lose that stage. OP's response. No one can deny what I've done for that parish and for those children. It hurts that everything is reduced to a single episode and years of dedication are ignored. If they were really only concerned about the environment, they would have talked to me before making decisions. Instead, they preferred to push me aside without considering that I'm also a mother and that it was important for Amelia to see me active there. Sometimes prudential decisions end up punishing more than they correct. Anonymous User 2 says, you say you were an exemplary mother in the parish, but in parallel you were turning the church into a place for your strategies. That's inconsistency, not exemplarity. The fact that you see yourself as dedicated doesn't erase the fact that you crossed a very clear line. And yes, a space with children has every right to say, this far and no further, when someone doesn't distinguish their personal problems from their service. OP's response. Life isn't so neat that everything is in separate boxes. I also have the right to have my conflicts and my emotions, even if I participate in things with children. I didn't do anything indecent in front of them. I didn't expose them directly to anything. The fact that they now want to act as if I were a danger to their formation seems exaggerated to me. I may have made a mistake in how I handled a situation, but that doesn't erase the good I did. Anonymous User 3 says, what's painful to read is that you're more concerned about having lost your leading role than the fact that your daughter and other children were in the middle of your moves. You talk about titles, stages, shining, but almost nothing about how it affected them to see their adult figures using the church for romantic dramas. That lack of self-criticism is precisely what confirms that Anna was right to push you aside for a while. OP's response. It's very easy to put it in those terms when looking from the outside. For me, service in the parish was part of what sustained my daughter. It also gave her an environment, a routine, a sense of belonging. To now say that all of that was just a stage for me is unfair. Of course it hurts to have lost that space, but not because it was a leading role, but because that's where I could best accompany Amelia. The fact that my emotions got mixed in doesn't mean that everything else was false. Update 4. While I was dealing with this new uncomfortable place in the parish, Leonardo continued with his life. He didn't go to the same mass as me, so he didn't hear that homily that left me trembling live. But in a small community, news travels fast, and his mother, who is friends with several ladies from the Rosary group, took it upon herself to connect the dots. According to what I was told later, she called him during the week to tell him something like the priest had spoken about a woman who dressed to seduce instead of taking care of the child, and that it seemed I had made a scene again. Obviously, he got the version where I came out as the one causing a scandal, not the one who had been humiliated in the hallway. When the next visitation schedule review came up, I thought the parish matter was a separate issue, something between my spiritual life and my community environment. But Leonardo knew how to take advantage of it. In the meeting with the lawyers and the psychologist handling Amelia's case, he mentioned with that calm tone he uses to look like the sensible one that he was worried because I was mixing personal matters into religious contexts where the child was present. He said there were comments about my behavior in the parish, that the priest himself had had to address the topic of setting an example for the little ones because of specific situations. It wasn't a strong legal accusation, but it added another stain to the picture he wanted to paint. Hearing that lit a fire inside me. I felt that what I was experiencing as a punishment or a spiritual correction was also becoming a weapon in his favor. I couldn't go to that meeting and use the parish as a testament to what a good mother I was, because right now I was set aside from almost everything. He, on the other hand, could say that even there, measures had to be taken because of my way of handling things. It seemed profoundly unfair to me that something that is supposed to be a space of faith would end up feeding the file of a visitation schedule. I tried to defend myself by saying they were exaggerations, that the parish is a place full of people who talk, that anything gets magnified. I added that I still took Amelia to Mass, that I complied with everything, that you couldn't use a general homily as proof of anything, but it was evident that the comment had left its mark on those present. The psychologist took notes. Leonardo's lawyer nodded as if it were a relevant piece of information, and my lawyer looked at me with that "this doesn't help" face. I left that appointment with the feeling that every false step I took in my personal life turned into ammunition for the other side. Meanwhile, in the parish, I no longer had the same voice. I couldn't go and say that it was all misunderstandings and expect them to believe me like before, because now I was the woman who was no longer in catechism or the children's choir, and for many, that weighed more than any explanation. I found myself in a kind of no man's land, too pointed out to be a model for anything, but still too present to disappear completely. And Leonardo, without making grand gestures, capitalized on that image in front of the person who had to decide about our daughter's life. It hurt to admit that in the end he was coming out as the father focused on the child, the one who doesn't mix scenarios, the one who comes, does his duty, and leaves. I, on the other hand, appeared as the one who brought her romantic messes to church, the one who sought the spotlight, the one who needed to be corrected from the pulpit. I started to create an internal narrative to protect myself. I repeated that he was an expert at looking good, that he knew how to use the right words in the right places, that I was more transparent, and that's why I ended up exposed. It was easier to think that than to accept that my decisions had given him plenty of material to support his role. Comments on Update 4. Anonymous User 1 says, "What you call a weapon in Leonardo's hands is simply a consequence of your own actions. No one forced the priest to talk about the subject. No one forced the coordinator to set you aside. If even in your religious environment they had to set limits for you, it's logical that he would use it to show a pattern. It's not that he capitalizes on your mistakes, it's that you gave him all the pieces to do so." OP's response. "It seems very convenient to say it like that when you're not the one in the middle holding 1,000 fronts. I don't live thinking about how everything will sound in a file. I live reacting to what's in front of me. The fact that he then takes advantage of every stumble to look like the perfect father is not something I control. And yes, I may have given more material than I should have, but that doesn't take away his responsibility in how he decided to use it." Anonymous User I says, "It bothers you that you can't use the parish as proof of what a good mother you are, but you forget that it was you who eroded that image right there. It wasn't Leonardo who removed you from the children's choir, it was the community itself. He only pointed out a fact, that even in that space there were problems with your behavior. It's not that he gains points, it's that you were losing them on your own." OP's response. "The community also makes mistakes, it's not infallible. Sometimes it gets carried away by appearances and rumors, just like any other human group. Just because they made certain decisions doesn't necessarily mean I'm the monster they now want to see. Leonardo takes advantage of that margin of doubt, and I understand that, but that doesn't erase the number of times I was supporting activities and our daughter while he was conspicuously absent." Anonymous User 3 says, "You take refuge again in the idea that he knows how to look good and you are too transparent, when in reality what is seen is that he had more self-control and you let yourself be carried away by the need for attention. It's not that he's a master manipulator, it's that you didn't calculate that your scenes have consequences beyond the adrenaline of the moment. Now it hurts you that those consequences are used against you, but you don't want to admit where they come from." OP's response. "I'm not going to deny that my decisions have had an impact, but I'm also not going to buy the idea that it all boils down to my lack of control and his supposed perfection. He also benefited for years from me being everywhere, from the parish seeing me as the one supporting Amelia, the fact that now they only focus on my missteps and forget about everything else is what I find unbalanced. Just because he's calmer when he speaks doesn't make him the only adult in this story." Update 5. Over time, everything that happened in the parish became more diffuse on the outside, but very clear in the memory of those who lived it. For me, however, it became easier and easier to summarize it in a simple sentence when someone new asked about my situation. Instead of going into details about homilies, hallways, coordinators, and legal meetings, I started saying that my ex-husband was very controlling, that he had left me practically broke and had made my life impossible just out of jealousy, even because of how I dressed in church. That clean, compact version fit well in quick conversations. No one was going to ask me for the complete file. I still go to Mass, but it's not the same. I sit in a side pew, sing softly. I participate without drawing attention. The choir sounds without me. The children line up for communion without me organizing the rows. They no longer ask me to read the lessons or help at the get-togethers. In the photos they post on the parish's social media, I appear occasionally in the background, never in the center. The ladies greet me warmly, but there's a distance that didn't exist before. I, in my mind, translate it as exaggerated prudence on their part, not as a consequence of what I did. I tell myself they still care about me, that they're just being overly sensitive for fear of scandal. With friends who don't know the parish well, I tell the story in the key of a misunderstood woman. I say I tried to get my family back, that any woman in my place would have wanted the same, that the only thing I did was dress up a little more one day, so he would see that he could still see something. When I mention the phrase cover up, it's cold, I always present it as proof of how cruel Leonardo can be, of how he's capable of making me feel small even in the house of God. I don't talk about the touches, the laughs, the perfume, or how I used the hallway as a catwalk. Those details are secondary to me. Sometimes, when I look at myself in the glass of the door before entering the church, I fleetingly think of Anna telling me that the problem wasn't the clothes, but what I did with the situation. That phrase pops up like an annoying insect in my head. Before it can settle, I crush it with another one. I should be able to dress however I want. The problem is that others exaggerate everything. It's a way of protecting myself. If I start dwelling too much on what I contributed to the disaster, I run the risk of tearing down the image of a good mother and good Christian that I still need to sustain myself. With Amelia, I try to maintain the soft version. I tell her that her dad and I didn't get along, that sometimes adults hurt each other without meaning to, that the important thing is that we both love her. I don't get into the part where she saw me playing at being something more than her mom in a church hallway. I prefer to think she was too young to notice. When I leave her with her father and see that she goes calmly, I tell myself that at least in that we did relatively well. She doesn't have to carry the labels that others put on us. In the end, what I'm left with is a different routine, without a choir, without groups, without the central role I enjoyed so much, but with the certainty that I still go to Mass, I still accompany my daughter in her faith, and I am still, in my own eyes, a woman who only wanted to recover what had been broken. What others remember of me in the parish, whether as a model, a warning, or a piece of gossip, I no longer control. And, honestly, I prefer to stick with the story in which I was punished for exaggerations and jealousy than with the version in which I myself put too many things at stake for a scene in a hallway. That version might be more complete, but it would also be a confession I'm not willing to give to anyone. Comments on Update 5. Anonymous User 1 says, "The strong thing is that you no longer need anyone else to distort the story. You yourself cut it down until it fits the role you want. You know exactly which detail to omit to keep seeing yourself as a good mother and a misunderstood good Christian. It's not that you lack clarity, it's that you prefer a comfortable half-truth to an uncomfortable whole truth." OP's response. Everyone tells what they can carry. I've been through enough scrutiny to continue bearing every corner of my life to anyone who asks. If I choose to stick with certain aspects of the story, it's because I need to keep functioning. I don't owe anyone a complete report. What I know in my heart and what I work on with God is my business, not for those who want to see every detail to decide how much right I have to feel hurt. Anonymous User I says, "You keep talking about exaggerations and jealousy, as if everything got out of control because of others, when in reality the chain started with your decision to use your ex, your daughter, and the church as proof that you could still seduce him. What hurts is not that you were imperfect, it's that you don't even allow yourself the minimal amount of visible self-criticism. You cling to the martyr pose because it protects you from the blow of taking your part." OP's response. Self-criticism doesn't mean displaying my mistakes in a showcase for everyone to point at. I already know what things I don't want to fall into again. I already know what limits I don't want to test again, but I work on that in my privacy, not in the public judgment of others. Clinging to my dignity is not a pose, it's defense, because if I let myself be carried away by all the versions others have of me, I have nothing left of my own. Anonymous User 3 says, "You say you don't control what others remember about you in the parish, but you keep trying to control what you remember yourself. erasing entire chunks. As long as you can't look at yourself completely, with the good and the bad, you're going to keep spinning in the same story. Him the cruel one, you the misunderstood one. It's comfortable, but it's also the reason you were left without a choir, without groups, and without the role you needed so much. OP's response. I don't need anyone to come and tell me how much I have to look at myself to move forward. For me, moving forward has been continuing to go to Mass, even when I felt pointed out, continuing to take care of my daughter, even though I was left without the spaces I had before. Continuing to get up even though they took away my titles and roles. The fact that I don't show everyone the entire process doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I simply decided that the only story I'm going to leave in the hands of others is the one that allows me to keep walking, not the one they want to use to sentence me once again.